To know one's enemy is to have defeated them before they have even fought. Darth Sidious understood this concept better than anyone. He took advantage of 1,000 years of groundwork laid by the Rule of Two and brought about the ruin of the Jedi and the fall of the once glorious Republic. Establishing the Empire, he had officially won. For nearly 2 decades he ruled, now unchallenged. That was until the glorious Empire had clumsily fallen due to the actions of a rebel insurgency and a single new Jedi Knight. After having detailed Palpatine's machinations before and during the Clone Wars, it's outright preposterous that such a disaster could have befallen the long-awaited Empire and its Emperor. But when we scrutinize Palpatine's mindset towards the rebellion, we can pinpoint exactly where he went wrong. The holocrons open again, my friends, and today they reveal to us the greatest mistake that the Emperor ever made when dealing with the Rebel Alliance. A mistake which would cost Palpatine the Empire, and had taken nearly a millennium to form. But before we decode these Imperial files, we have learned that our transmissions have been tapped. Someone is listening in on the other end. Some of you who are watching have not yet subscribed. If our own Empire is to stand strong, we must learn from the mistakes of Palpatine together. So force crush that subscribe button and join us today. It is your destiny. As we said, to know one's enemy is to have truly defeated them before they ever fight. The Sith lived for thousands of years. It was the way of the great Marker Ragnos to have pitted his enemies against each other, having them fight so that they were weakened and unable to challenge him. When establishing the Eternal Empire, Valkorion weakened the Sith and the Republic by keeping them embroiled in war, before swooping in and destroying them both systematically. Palpatine himself puppeteered the Clone Wars in order to spread the Jedi out across the galaxy thin, leaving them alone and vulnerable. Palpatine did this because he knew the Jedi could not resist helping a galaxy that was in need. They'd spread themselves thin, leaving massive gaps within their ranks. They would then be alone when Order 66 was enacted, and at this point, Palpatine's Grand Army, his warships, and his rulership was largely theoretical. He was in control of it all, but they were not fully subservient to him alone. Working covertly though, Palpatine slithered around in the shadows, pulling the strings of his enemies, exploiting their weaknesses. He was not yet ready to respond with overwhelming force, and so he had to use more clandestine methods. Ironically, despite the fact that he greatly desired overwhelming firepower, his subtle manipulations were easily 10 times as effective against his enemy. The Jedi were destroyed before they knew that they had lost. Many of them were shot in the back and never knew why. It was because Palpatine knew his enemy. He sank his fangs into their ankle. It began as small, quick bites, but the venom spread into their veins and waited years before disintegrating them from the inside out. However, despite how excellent Sidious was at playing this game, he didn't seem to enjoy it. Using underhanded tactics were effective, but taxing and time-consuming, and even before he became the Emperor, he was already making plans on how to build the most impenetrable army, the most devastating navy, and the Death Star. The Death Star to rule the skies like an angry god, ready to smite any who would dare oppose the glory of the Empire. The idea was for the Empire itself to be so airtight, so omnipotent, that it could never be approached. In this way, all the dissenters would look once at the might of the Empire, and then forever have their hope to fight, their courage shattered under its bootstep. This is the essence of rule by fear. This was the way of defeating his enemies before he ever fought them. But in the words of Princess Leia to Grand Moff Tarkin, the tighter you squeeze, the more systems slip between your fingers. Sidious's iron-fisted rule served to breed an insurgency that would come together neatly, forming the alliance to restore the Republic. The groundwork of this had been laid by Padme Amidala 20 years earlier, when she organized the delegation of 2,000. Palpatine, of course, had been aware of the delegation, and either got rid of everyone who signed it, or frightened them enough to renounce it following. After Padme's death, he had complete control, and after this, he thought little of it. But the Emperor should have paid very close attention, as Mon Mothma and Bail Organa became the masterminds behind bringing together each isolated rebel cell into one great alliance. Each little sparkle of resistance coalesced into a shining beacon of hope, and once again the Emperor became aware. But this time, rather than take them seriously, he laughed at their insolence and responded with more oppression. The Imperial crackdowns were immense, and all dissenters that were found received terrible fates. For a while, it truly did look as though the alliance was a waste of time. The Empire seemed invincible and omniscient, making it a daily battle for the alliance to do so much as to move. But eventually, they started to get a foothold, their organization became more efficient, and soon, they even penetrated the ranks of the Empire itself. And this brings us to labeling his first great mistake, underestimating his foes simply because they did not possess the Force. Palpatine continued to believe that they weren't as big of a threat because they had no Jedi to rally around them, no capital ships even to pose a threat to his fleet, and a pathetic excuse for an army that could in no way rival the Stormtrooper Corps. Not to mention, he continued to hold out on really cracking down until the Death Star was completed. He knew that once the superweapon was operational, he could squash the rebellion with a few displays of the planet-busting power. But in the meantime, he left the concern of the Alliance to the ISB. He only dispatched the Inquisitorius and Vader when sightings of Jedi began to arise on worlds such as Lothal. In actuality though, Palpatine would have been wiser to scatter his numbers out much sooner. While the Inquisitors were more suited for hunting Jedi, a simple direction of their efforts could have made them a terrifying threat to rebel cells. Contrast to Grand Admiral Thrawn, who advised that smaller, elite death squadrons would be appropriate to dispatch against the rebels. The large fleets were too slow to move from one place to another in a timely manner, according to him. This then left them open to rebel hit-and-run tactics, because they were garnering intel on the Empire's movements extremely quickly. Smaller teams could find and root out rebels with ruthless efficiency. But rather than adhere to that and being effective, Sidious was committed to the idea of raw displays of power, not small displays as he had during the Clone War, thus bringing us to his second biggest mistake. He did not use what he knew about his enemy. Palpatine did not take them seriously until they destroyed the Death Star. This broke him from his apathy and made Sidious realize that they were a genuine threat. And the Battle of Yavin was simply meant to be a demonstration to destroy the Alliance headquarters. It was only meant to discourage other cells at first. But when the rebellion scored that massive win, everything changed. Sidious was enraged and issued his apprentice to personally handle the situation. Vader was perhaps the most effective person to take on this task, and for the next several years, he would have the rebels on the run, putting the fear of the Empire back into them. But unfortunately, he was dispatched too late. The cracks had already begun to form in the Emperor's armor, and it was exposed to the masses that they were not as infallible as they once seemed. Here is where Sidious truly went wrong though. The Emperor turned his sights inward and began attempting to solve the problems within the Empire. Within his manifesto, he speaks of the exhaustion he has with the incompetence of his officers. The Emperor saw only a handful of men, Tarkin being one of them, who truly understood what the Empire's mission was. But now Tarkin was dead, and he had to rely on less efficient men. Palpatine began trying to fix every minute issue with upper management, attempting to organize even more crazy superweapons, bioweapons, and more. He was stubbornly committed with using broad displays of power to retake the image of grandiosity that the Empire had built. He was more concerned with this than actually winning. Everything had to be big, scary, and loud. This war was not just about wiping out the rebellion, it was about doing it in an inferno so bright that every planet in the galaxy could feel its heat. He saw surgical strikes as beneath him because he didn't think it would send a loud enough message. But casting a big enough net only proves to leave larger holes, and the rebellion would just barely slip through. Time and time again, they managed to find the cracks in each scheme and exploit it with heroism, strategy, and a ton of luck. Palpatine abandoned his ways of learning about his enemy, taking them apart from the inside. Perhaps this was because he couldn't find a way in, since the rebels proved to be so evasive. But he fell into the mistake that the Sith had once repeatedly done against the Republic. Palpatine kept hitting them hard from the outside, whether through copious amounts of propaganda, bigger military sweeps, or having Vader himself show up and lay down the law. But it was all simply not enough. In Legends, even Vader knew to infiltrate the rebels from the inside. He dispatched his own personal shadow hand, Shira Bree, to disguise herself as a rebel pilot, and she even gained the trust of the entire Alliance. Her mission was to assassinate the boy who had destroyed the Death Star, Luke Skywalker, or at least caused him to be ostracized from the rest of his friends. But in this instance, the Force informed Luke subconsciously that Shira was a threat, causing the Jedi to shoot her down when they stole a pair of TIE fighters. She would eventually go on to be rebuilt by Vader with cybernetics, and would don the identity of Lady Lumaya. But even though her mission had failed, Vader himself showed more insight into how to dismantle the rebels than Palpatine ever did, at least not until the very end. The Emperor attempted to correct his mistakes with the 4th year of the Great Galactic Civil War. Building the Death Star 2 in the shadows, he resolved to make it larger and stronger than before. However, this weapon wasn't the real threat. This was just the bait. He allowed the Bothan spies to find the plans to the superweapon and lure the Rebel Alliance into a trap on Endor. They would arrive, thinking they could take down the shield generator and repeat their victory on Yavin 4. But they would be fooled. for Sidious had dispatched a legion of his finest troops on the forest moon below. There would be a full armada of Star Destroyers off to the side, and the Death Star 2 was fully operational despite being under construction. It was a trap truly worthy of a Dark Lord, the kind of subtle manipulation that he should have been showing from the very beginning. Unfortunately though for the Dark Lord, it was too little, too late. The Republic had been such an undeniable force that Palpatine himself could not deny its power and influence. The constant defeat of the Sith at the hands of the Jedi and the Republic for thousands of years had proved to be enlightening to Palpatine. For the first time, he met an enemy in the Republic where his arrogance could not blind him to their power and their scope of influence. But now, the hooks of doubt had sunk deeply into Vader's conscience because of his son, who was now a Jedi. Palpatine couldn't have possibly accounted for the Ewoks, whose primitive ways of war confounded the machinery and the organized tactics of the Imperial military. And as we've talked about extensively, Palpatine's lack of interest in bolstering his Starfighter Corps left the TIEs ineffectual against the fancy flying of the Millennium Falcon, the ship that slipped into the Death Star's main reactor. Sidious's largest mistake, though, was his ego causing him to neglect the small things, and it would be his contempt for the small that would utterly destroy him in the end. And that by far is Sidious's greatest philosophical mistake when facing down the rebels. We don't often talk about the period of the Empire, the Galactic Civil War, but the idea of what exactly toppled Darth Sidious is fascinating, and how the rebels were basically the perfect threat to Palpatine, not because they were large and imposing, but because they weren't. But anyway, my friends, thank you so much for watching the archives today, as your viewership makes this all possible. Until next time, my friends, may the Force be with you, and have an incredible day.